You could just sit down in the audience.
Now tell me, how do I switch this on? Can you? What?
Unmute yourself.
I think I'm okay.
No, unmute yourself.
Oh.
Microphone, remember?
Hello. Have I not done that?
Look, it's unmuted. Maybe quiet up on the desk. Give that a little tap.
Hello.
Oh, yeah.
Is that all right?
Yeah, I'll adjust that.
Okay.
Well, good evening, everyone. And I think we'll make a start. And oh, no, it's terrible. What a rowdy audience we have tonight. With all the miscreants. And
Oh dear.
this is a sign of things to come, I'm afraid. No, thank you all very much for coming out again. And also welcome to people watching on our YouTube channel. Very pleased to welcome back. This is the fourth time, Tim was saying, that he's been and given a talk to us in the hall. And certainly the first three occasions, they've been very well received. And I'm no doubt at all that this fourth one will be equally well received. So it's tremendous that Tim's made the effort to come down from Inverness and join us in the hills this evening. And thank you very much all for coming along. I hope you really enjoy tonight's talk. I think it's going to be fascinating.
I hope so.
Well, I've never heard of Lachlan Macquarie before. I know that most of you in the audience will have had some knowledge of him, but I suspect we're all going to find out a bit more. Certainly, I'm looking forward to finding out more than I gleaned off Wikipedia when I had to suss the man out. But he sounds like a fascinating person, and certainly somebody who is going to entertain us tonight through Tim. So thank you very much for coming, and sit back and enjoy the evening.
Oh, hello, everybody, and thank you for coming tonight. Can I just start by asking how many people have been to Australia? Okay. How many people have been to Sydney? Same lot, probably. Now, you're a very honest audience, I know. Is there anybody here who has not heard of Macquarie before Mike started giving all his PR? Oh, well done, well done. That's because, you know, what is the expression? A prophet is not without honour in his own country. I think Macquarie is one of Scotland's mysteries, because actually he should have statues all over the place. And today is a remarkably good day for me to give you a talk about Macquarie. His birthday is tomorrow, if he was alive. And 4 days ago, we had Australia Day. And I don't know if you've been reading the press, there's a lot of controversy about Australia Day and whether they should still have it and all that sort of business. And I'm not here to discuss the ins and outs of our colonial history, which we seem to be doing ad nausea at the moment. However, I would just like to say, well, I'll ask another question. Has anybody read a book called The Fatal Shore by Robert Hughes? Anyway, I'm not trying to be libelous, whatever the word is, but this book, The Fatal Shore, was written about 20 years ago, 25 years ago, and it was a bestseller. And it was all about how we gunned down the Aboriginals, how we flogged everybody in sight, how badly we behaved. And actually, it's now come to light that most of it, or a lot of it, or we did some bad things, was complete fiction. And he put into the real people's names things that they'd never done. And unfortunately, I think that that book sort of spread the word that you know how bad we were and how bad everything was. And I hope that tonight I'll be able to put the record straight a little because of this chap, Macquarie. It's a sad story in a way because he was extremely badly treated when he finished his time in Australia after 12 years as the governor and got back to London, extremely badly treated, and we'll hear about that. The theme running through tonight is that Macquarie saw almost solely that Australia was a colony that needed to be a nation, not a penal settlement. And he was way before his time with us, because back in London, all they wanted to do was to lock people up in Botany Bay. Anyway, so that, if you sort of remember that through. Now, so it may be a bit disjointed. It's a bit of Australian history, a bit of a travelogue, but I hope if I've done nothing else, that a few of you might actually venture to Mull sometime and go to his mausoleum and actually see where he's buried and know just a little bit more about the man himself. Oh, and I've got one more thing to say. I may sound English, and when I'm in Australia, I'm called a pommy bastard because of this unfortunate voice I've got. But my mother's from Brisbane. I was at school partly in Brisbane. My father's mother's from Sydney. Her great-great-grandfather sailed out from St Andrews, so I've got a bit of Scottish blood in me. And the great-great-great-grandfather married a convict's daughter. So I have got convict blood in me, okay? That explains it all. That explains it all, yes. Okay, right, here we go. So there is the great man, Macquarie. There aren't many pictures of him, but I thought before we got on to the man himself, we'd just run through a bit of Australian history. And I'm told that audiences like real pictures that the lecturer, that the talker has got. So that I took that in Botany Bay. This is the stone where Cook's cousin, his wife's cousin is Midshipman Smith, landed. He was the first white man from that expedition to land there. There's my wife. That's the obelisk to Botany Bay. And 1770 is the date you remember. So Australia actually is a remarkably young country. And the other thing I was very delighted to see, I went to Taunton when I was printing with the engravings organization that I was part of, and that is Cook's original chart of the east coast of Australia. That's the actual piece of paper he did on board the ship Endeavour. Okay, now, this is white history. This is colonial white history. And Abel Tasman, he founded what became Van Diemen's Land and then Tasmania. Dampier got to the north bit around Darwin. And then 1770, Captain James Cook landed and went into Botany Bay, where Joseph Banks found all these wonderful flowers and fauna, Banksias and everything else. And they thought it was rather a good harbour, but actually it wasn't as good as Sydney. And Cook didn't actually get into Sydney, but as he passed the entrance to the Heads, and as you go into Sydney Harbour, which is probably the greatest harbour in the world, you see these two great heads on either side, and he noted in his log, looks like a good harbour. And then some 18 years later, when we had lost the colonies in America and the War of Independence, they didn't know where to send all these baddies, so-called baddies, who'd stolen a sheep or a loaf of bread or something. And so they sent them to Botany Bay. And the first fleet arrived, and is that they say the 18th? They should say the 28th of January there. 11 ships arrived, and that is now what they call Australia Day. And actually, I suppose I can see why now it's a bit of an anomaly, because Australia is so full of other ethnic groups. Anyway, so they started, and Cook actually was a kind man. He didn't shoot Aboriginals. Philip was a remarkable man too. The governor, he took the fleet out and then became the governor. And Hunter, who was his second in command, he was a kind chap too. So a lot of the stories that you get about how badly we treated the indigenous people are actually not true. What the problem was that they hadn't got a law against stealing. And the colony was so bereft of food that the worst thing you could do was to steal a chicken or a cow or a sheep. And of course, the Aboriginals, that was just what they did. So then we get to Bligh, and he came out to try and stop rum being the currency. And he was mutiny prone, as you may know, and the soldiers and the high-ups in Australia did not want their rum to be stopped and as a currency, so they actually found him under a bed and locked him up. And Macquarie was sent out to sort all this out, send the ringleaders back to England to be tried. But when you think that it takes 6 to 8 or even 9 months to get to and from Australia, and in March, my wife and I are flying direct to Perth from Heathrow in 17 hours, it's quite a thought that London was trying to administer something that was virtually 2 years away in messaging. And then Thomas Brisbane, also a Scot, came. I sometimes wonder if the Australians know, why Brisbane's called Brisbane, why Sydney's called Sydney. They just haven't got a clue. These are all colonial ministers. Right, I just thought I'd show you this. I know a lot of you haven't been to, but you must have seen pictures of liners in Sydney, and this is Sydney Cove, and this was done by a convict 2 or 3 months after they first landed. Look at the beautiful work he'd done. And here is the Opera House, right? Here's the bridge. Here's where the liners lie up. And the great thing about this cove was it had water, the tank stream there. But already 3 months later, they took the governor's palace or the governor's house out in bits, prefabbed out. It was a pretty ramshackle bit, but it was about there. So they'd started. So that's just basically and there is Macquarie. I rather like this picture of him with this Australian background of eucalyptus tree and everything else. And they're the other three governors, or the 4 governors before him. So there we go. Now we start off with a bit about Macquarie, who was born in Alva, the island of Alva, off the edge of Mull. It's a beautiful island. I've been there twice. Has anybody here been to Alva? Oh God! Oh well, then okay. And it's got lovely, and there's a Telford church, and lovely sort of wooded walks, but it's thought that there were about 600 people living on Alva then. So I say to myself, what a wonderful schooling this chap must have had. There he was, because aged 15, he joined the army, and he fought. First of all, he went to Canada, he went to North America, the War of Independence. I went to India twice. He went to Egypt. He went through Russia. So, you know, pretty traveled man for that time of the day, of the year. And that is where we think he was born, or Meg. And that is a picture I took just to entice those of you who haven't been to Alva. That's a picture I took last year when Janet and I went over. This is an excellent pub. You get fantastic fish and crab and prawns. And I think the 4 people who run the pub are almost the only people who live on Alva now. Slightly sad, but previously, this is a new marina that they're just building, and all the boats to Stafford go. That's now a great big thing to go to see Fingal's Cave, and I suspect Fingal's Cave must be pretty spoilt. I don't know. Right, so Macquarie, in his wanderings and all his fightings and everything else, he managed to woo 2 women. He had 2 really love match marriages. But sadly, the first one, Jane Jarvis, died after 3 years. She died in Macau, and he was absolutely distraught by this. But she did manage to give him a fair sum of money, and he bought an estate in Mull, which he called Jarvis Field, which is just by where he's buried. And then he married, or then he found Elizabeth Campbell. And in Australia, particularly in Sydney, there are an awful lot of, there's a Campbelltown, there's a Campbell's Wharf, and everybody thinks it's because of the Scots clan Campbells. Well, it is, but it's actually because of Elizabeth Campbell, nee Campbell. And she was, again, like him, she was a remarkable woman. She was right behind him in everything he did and forged everything ahead. Now, when on the long voyage that took 8 or 9 months, Macquarie must have given a lot of thought to what he was going to do. And this thing about everybody being equal. I mean, Australia today, I don't think it's entirely true, but think that they're all equals and it's sort of fair go. Everybody's got a chance. And this is really where it all started, because Macquarie decided that everybody was going to be equal, whether they were convicts or not. And he arrived, and I'm just going to use a note here to tell you. When he arrived, he was absolutely welcomed, because the Bligh thing hadn't been a great success, and he started to rather than make it a fatal shore, he started to make it a blessed shore. Because excuse me, I'm going to read a few notes so I don't miss them all out. So the mood in Sydney definitely brightened up. Everybody sort of welcomed him. And one of the first things he did is he named the bit of green, not Botanic Garden, but the bit of green in the middle of the city bit. He named that, would you believe, Hyde Park. And he got horse racing going. And of course, the Australians still absolutely adore their Melbourne Cup and their horse racing. And everyone was having a good time. He then, he built bridges, he built a hospital, he built a school for the Aboriginal children. He believed that the Aboriginals were just as much entitled to British rule and British law as anybody else. He installed a printing press. As an ex-printer myself, I was quite amused. They got out there, he didn't have enough A's. So they had to turn V's upside down, and everybody had to understand that when they saw a big V upside down, it was actually an A. But he installed a printing press and got a newspaper going. He installed a post office. Now, he was told to stop rum, but he was quite clever. He knew sort of that he couldn't stop it. So he taxed it, and he shut down a lot of the nastiest bars. But he was very clever. He knew he would have a revolution if he stopped it completely. He started charity schools. He encouraged matrimony, because up to then everybody was just sleeping with everybody else, and there was no sort of law about anything. He closed as many of the brothels as he possibly could. He made a declaration promising that he would be available to anybody in an emergency. He didn't actually say what an emergency was. And his great thing was the best people must be able to do, the best job deserves the best people. So it's a sort of meritocracy, or whatever the word is. And that again is something Australia sort of thinks it's very proud of. He allowed the law, judicial benches, to be manned by ex-felons. That didn't go down awfully well. He encouraged farmers, because one of the problems on his arrival was that they were nearly starving. In fact, he managed, from his time in India, he managed to get a shipment of wheat from Bengal, and it virtually saved everybody in New South Wales. He said no death sentences except for murder, no flogging except if a special judge orders it, and I want to know all about it. He met every ship on arrival, whether he did personally, I don't know, but he certainly did some, and he would come on board, and he would ask the convicts, had they been well treated, because a convict that was practically dead or sick was no good to him because he couldn't work. So that was the first thing. And then instead of putting him in irons, they were allowed to go off and find their own rooms, but they had to come back the next morning and muster. And only the baddies, the really baddies who weren't going to change their ways, were the ones that were put in these chain gangs to make the roads and things. He entertained at a government house, and he entertained everybody. And this was one of the problems. We could come on to it. So, and a police force, and he and Elizabeth toured New South Wales. Mark you, there was, by that stage, they'd only gone 20 miles, so there wasn't a great deal. But when everything was happening, where they were building, where they were making roads, whatever they're doing, he would jump into his horse and carriage with his wife Elizabeth, and they would go around and take an interest in what was happening. And that is what he said about the Aboriginals. Again, that is not what comes out in some of the books, where I'm not saying we didn't treat them, some of them badly. And there was one incident that he had when unfortunately some Aboriginals were shot, but he took them into his house, and he was absolutely sure that they should get a good go. And that is a picture of Sydney Cove before he arrived. You can see the Aboriginal here. This is where the ferries now go out to Manly. Who's been on a Manly ferry? I bet some people have been on a ferry from Manly. So you would have boarded about there, okay? This is what they call now the Rocks. The Opera House is round here. And when Macquarie left, that's what Sydney looked like, which is quite a thriving place, I think you'd agree. And now this picture I took last year, there's a Manly ferry. You will know what this is here. And so this picture here is taken from about there. There's the tank stream I mentioned coming down. So the Opera House is there. And this is the rock going out to the Rocks, and the bridge would start about here. So you get where we are sort of from today and then. And that is what Macquarie said when he went there. I'm not quite sure it makes total sense to me, but he wasn't desperately pleased with what he saw. And that is the picture of Bligh, that's in the church, Bligh being removed from under his bed by the Rum Corps. And these were the people called the Rum Corps who didn't want their rum stopped. And a lot of this stuff, the Australians absolutely love it. Anything to do with this sort of history, they just devour. And the Mitchell Library, which is a wonderful library in Sydney, is full of this stuff. And you've got to be very, very persuasive to allow you to see it or to look at it. It's kept absolutely in vaults. Right, this is maybe slightly out of focus, but I think this audience is pretty good compared to the population of Scotland. I'm not sure how I went out into the middle of Inverness and asked passers-by whether they'd heard of Macquarie. I'm not sure that I'd get a lot of answers. If you go to Australia, if anybody read Bill Bryson's book Down Under, well, there you go. That's just, look at this, 47 roads, avenues, groves in Sydney named Macquarie. 47. There's a bank, there's a university, there's a dictionary. I'm not sure Aussies know what a dictionary is, but never mind. And Macquarie Street is the most important street in Sydney. Mark you, I think Macquarie was quite vain. I think a lot of this was named by him. But nevertheless, and then we've got he didn't, not to be too much with Macquarie, he then had Lachlan River and Lachlan Valley. So you can't go to Australia without hearing the word Macquarie. Now there is Elizabeth Macquarie, his second wife. She's rather a striking woman, I think. And she was a musician. Well, sorry, we'll come on first of all. This is Sydney Cove, the pictures that you've seen before. This is where the ferries go. This is where the liners berth. This is the road over to the bridge. And there's the Sydney Opera House. Okay, we've generally got, those people haven't been there, we've got the general bit. And this is the beautiful botanical gardens, which Elizabeth Macquarie refused to be built on. And it's still exactly almost like it was in Macquarie's day. I don't know if you can read this, I'm not sure I can, but you've got Mrs. Macquarie's chair, Mrs. Macquarie's walk, Mrs. Macquarie's bush, Mrs. Macquarie's everything. She's everywhere, all right? And she was also a musician, and that is her cello, which is in the museum in Sydney, a picture I took. So we reckon that is about, there were probably would have been fiddles in the fleet boats, but I doubt there was a cello. And she also brought out a grand piano. How the hell they took a grand piano in one of those old sailing boats, I just don't know. Maybe I'll go and find out next time I'm in Australia.
They're still in tune when they got to Australia.
What?
They're still in tune.
Well, we're probably playing Waltzing Matilda there now, shouldn't you? And Government House he had built by this chap Francis Greenway, which we will mention shortly, at Parramatta. Parramatta is up one of the rivers because the problem with Sydney Cove was that the soil was so bad, they couldn't grow anything. They got water, but they couldn't grow anything. And so they then went on an excursion up this river and found that up the top of the river, there's some rather nice arable land. And we went, Janet and I went there a pair of years ago, and that's what it looks like now. And a lot of Macquarie's furniture's in it. And I was rather touched by this coat of arms that's there. So somebody must have carved. I don't believe that came out from Great Britain. Somebody must have carved that. So that was in his government house. Now we come on to the kernel of his problem. These different, the Rum Corps I've mentioned, most of the Rum Corps, or nearly all the Rum Corps, went back with Bligh. They went back home with Bligh, and Macquarie brought his own regiment of the 73rd out with him, his own soldiers. So, but there were still people who were sort of attached to the Rum Corps and were not happy that rum, he was going to do things with rum, like get rid of it. Then the convicts, of course, there were, in his time, 160,000 convicts landed in Australia. That's an awful lot of people. And so no wonder they did, minimus things to get there. In fact, it was a bit like the £10 POM scheme in the 50s or the 60s. People went and stole a loaf of bread so they could get a free package to Australia. Now, Macquarie's great thing was, once a convict, no longer a convict. He either gave them an absolute pardon or a conditional pardon, according to the situation, and then they became an emancipist. Once you were an emancipist, you could do anything. You could be a judge, you could be a lawyer, and he had no worries at all. Once you had gone from that group to this group, you were like everyone else. The past was the past, and you were forging ahead, making his new nation. Now, the free settlers were people who saw eye to the main chance, so they came out on the ships wanting to make a quick buck and a fortune, and they really was rather hoity-toity people who thought the convicts should be their servants. But the exclusives were possibly even worse. They were wealthy free settlers, army officers, dare I say, and churchmen. And they did not like the idea that Macquarie was making everybody equal. In fact, they didn't like it a bit. One of the things that Macquarie did too was he wanted to open up the interior. And as I said, when he came, you could only go 20 miles inland, because I took that picture 2 years ago. That is the Blue Mountains to the west of Sydney, and the terrain is amazing. These trees are absolutely tightly packed, and these fissures, is that the right word, go, they're perpendicular for hundreds of feet. So getting through this little lot and over the tablelands to the new pastures beyond was a huge task. But they did it, and he built a road right through to Bathurst, which is town of Bathurst, which is named after Lord Bathurst, who was the colonial secretary and therefore Macquarie's immediate boss. He certainly knew, where the main chance lay. And this chap, John MacArthur, who I'm afraid was also a Scot, he got out on the second fleet. He was a really nasty bit of work. And he got out on the second fleet. He took some sheep. he managed to persuade the governor to give him a large amount of land, and he became almost overnight immensely rich. And he was one of the main people who just hated Macquarie because he thought that all these convicts should be on the land as shepherds and till the land and create this great sheep thing, which would be good for tax for Britain. And he was also one of the main players in the Rum Rebellion for Bligh. And in fact, he had to flee Australia in a ship to go back to England because he knew he could be tried in Australia for rebellion, mutiny. But even worse was this chap they call the Flogging Parson. And I'm going to read you a few words about this too, because I think this is absolutely wonderful. He was an even nastier bit of work, I'm afraid. And this is what Macquarie said in a letter to Lord Bathurst about Marston. I am grieved to be compelled to say so of any man of his sacred profession, but I do believe that there is no more malicious or more vindictive, unfeeling character in existence than the Reverend Mr. Marston. So that's quite a good CV. And then when he was interviewing Marston and saying he could no longer, Marston refused to sit as a JP with an ex-felon who'd been an ex-convict who'd been a felon, so-called. So Macquarie's words to Marston, this is wonderful too. Viewing you now, sir, as head of a seditious, low cabal, and consequently unworthy of mixing in private society or intercourse with me, I beg to inform you that I never wish to see you on public duty, and I cannot help lamenting that any man of your sacred profession should be so much lost to every good feeling of justice, generosity, and gratitude as to manifest with such deep-rooted malice, rancor, hostility, and vindictive opposition to one who has never injured you. So, so that was quite a good job appraisal. And then Macquarie got published in the Sydney Gazette. His Excellency the Governor is pleased to dispense with the services of the Right Reverend Marston as Justice of the Peace and Magistrate of Parramatta and its surrounding districts. So there was no doubt about Marston. But Marston, unfortunately, as we'll hear, got hold of the people back in England and spread all these seditious things about Macquarie. Macquarie was the first man to use the word Australia. So Australia had actually been used first time by Matthew Flinders on one of Matthew Flinders' charts. Matthew Flinders was a navigator that circumnavigated Australia. I'll tell you just a quick aside about this. And it was of course it started off as New Holland, then it went to Terra Australis, and then Matthew Flinders coined this word Australia. And when I went to the Admiralty Chart Depot, you remember you saw the picture of Cook's chart. They also showed us the Flinders chart of him going around Australia, because we really didn't know if it was one bit of land or two or three or four at that stage. And I said to the chap who was showing it, I said, "Oh, I bet the Australians would like this." And he said, "They're not having anything ever again," really sort of. And I said, "Oh?" He said, "Yes, we lent it to them for the bicentenary and they sent us back a copy." And a neighbor of mine the other day knew I was keen on Macquarie, so she sent me this picture of the oldest pub in Australia, which is called the Macquarie Arms. She said, "I'm very sorry for the Toyota van in front of it." Now, Macquarie also started a bank. And instead of these promissory notes, he got a load of Spanish coins, and he got the convicts to cut out the middle, which we called a dump. That was 15 pence, and this was the holy dollar, would you believe, called the holy dollar. And what I rather like is the Macquarie Bank. Do you see the logo? Which is obviously a holy dollar still there. And so he started his proper currency. Now the next chap who was with Green was Francis Greenway, who was the architect of Australia. He didn't come out on the same ship as Macquarie, but he came out in one just after. And Macquarie, as you heard, went down and asked what people did. And Greenway had been in a architect's office in Bristol, and he'd been a forger. I'm not sure exactly what he forged. Anyway, this they think he so highly of him in Clifton that they put this plaque up on the wall. And Greenway came out, and Macquarie wanted to get all these buildings done. One of the first things he did was to get these brick factories. He got a lot of bricks made, and Macquarie really started. I'll show you his picture, some of the building, but I think it's quite funny that Macquarie now appears as the forger of the Australian currency. So there, I think that's me there actually. Well, it is. Just remember that clock, would you? So that's the barracks in Hyde Park, which Greenway built, one of the very first buildings in Australia. He built this first church in Sydney, St James, and it's really a remarkable building. And look at I took that picture of the interior. Look at that. I don't know whether the pews were made by convicts but just look at the sort of detail and everything in it. It's not bad, is it? So they really got going. The other thing he built Macquarie a castle. Now that castle is exactly where the Sydney Opera House is now. Okay, and in 1902, nobody quite knows why Macquarie built a castle for himself. I think it was a flashback to Scotland, But anyway, Greenway designed and they built this castle. And then in 1902, they needed a depot for the trams, for the Sydney trams. So they they blew it up, and it became a tram depot. And it was a tram depot right up until the Sydney Opera House was starting to be built. The other building that got Macquarie into a lot of hot water was the stables, which is now the School of Music, the New South Wales School of Music Conservatory. And Macquarie wanted stables for his horses. He had horses and carriages, and he went out in these. And Greenway produced these sort of ornamental thing on the top. And as we will hear, this was thought to be extravagance and extreme, and the British government in London couldn't afford this. And what was Macquarie doing? Making these beautiful buildings. And not only was it buildings, but there were the chap. Do you see I mentioned that clock? Well, this guy, James Oatley, he was transported in 1815. By 4 years later, he was keeper of the town clock and making clocks like this. So whatever talent there was in these ships was used to the absolute, full. And this is the earliest bit of furniture that was made. These were all crafted with pretty elementary tools, I would think. And then there were silversmiths. And this one here, this was for Macquarie when he opened or laid the foundation stone of a hospital, I think. But, it's beautiful stuff, isn't it? So these convicts weren't just convicts. Anyway, Macquarie was fighting the people who didn't want the the colony to be run like this. So word got back to England, to London, that the colony was, Macquarie was spending all this money. But what was actually happening, that more and more of these convicts that on arrival had to be fed and watered and looked after were pouring in, and this was costing money. Macquarie actually got the amount of money that it cost to run one convict down by a third during his time there, but this wasn't good enough for Westminster. So they sent this guy, big, 39-year-old bachelor QC, and he was virtually told what to write. He was to go and sort the place out, tell Macquarie he'd got to be much firmer, shouldn't be so lenient, that people were now crying out to go to Australia, and it had to go back to be a severe penal college, and transportation had to be a really nasty business. And look what he was asked to do, you see. It was disgraceful. He was paid £1,000 more than the governor, the same status of Macquarie. He had to go, I mean, it's sedition. He had to go and look into all these things. He had 18 months. And of course, the exclusives loved him. And they fed him all this business about how this convict should have remained at convicts. You see, convict labor was used on land rather than on buildings. Ornamented, I mentioned that, the building ornamenting to save costs. They even went around asking what complaints there were against the governor. And actually, there were very few because he was mostly very much loved. But Macquarie was pretty fed up at this stage. He was fighting these exclusives and doing his real best. He was absolute maniac worker, and he then sent his letter of resignation. But of course, a letter of resignation, it took 9 months to get to Lord Bathurst. It probably took 6 months to go around Whitehall and an answer to come back. But I think he was looking pretty drawn by this stage, and he wasn't a young man. So what did Macquarie do? Well, I think I've probably gone through most of these. I think I mentioned he got the grain. He planted wheat. He got farming going. He had to because people were dying of starvation. He increased trade hugely. He founded a currency and a bank, as we mentioned. He turned the roads from dirt to gravel. He built sewers, established traffic on the left. And he built all these schools and hospitals, churches, and a wonderful lighthouse. And 67, what an achievement, what a lot to do in 12 years. And he tried hard to make peace with Aboriginals, provide them an education. And as I said, he promoted, because he had two very happy marriages himself, he promoted marriage. And you couldn't, you didn't make you go to divine service, but the pubs were shut during divine service. And that is Sydney when he left. There again, there is Sydney Cove. There's the Opera House there. This is over the bridge this way. This is the rocks. Sydney's quite a hilly place, actually. It's quite, as you can see, it goes up and down a bit. And then that's a picture I took. I think Macquarie wanted all distances in America to be from Macquarie Place in Sydney. But if I was to ask a Sydney chap, as I did, where is Macquarie Place? Dunno, mate, he would say. That is the original obelisk designed by, again, Francis Green. It's still there, just up from Circular Quay. And this is Mrs. Macquarie. Can you read this? Mrs. Macquarie's chair, which is the best vantage place to look at the Opera House if any of you go out to Sydney again, or first time. And I thought I'd just take a picture of my 3 grandchildren sitting on Mrs. Macquarie's chair 3 years ago. And now this is all a bit, I don't want this to be, what is it, boring by PowerPoint or something, but this is his speech, Macquarie's speech at the end of his time. And you might say, well, he would say that, wouldn't he? But he, by constant maxim, reward merit, punish vice with regard to rank, class, or description of persons. And I think that sums it up pretty well. Then he went on, I have the happiness to reflect that I leave it in very different condition, blah, blah, blah. And I have bestowed on faithful, zealous, and conscious discharge of my public duties, which he did. Then he said, I'm aware that every man in public life, which is true today, is it not, may have enemies who would be in politics. And it would be unreasonable of me to expect totally exempt from the virulent attacks of party and disaffection. So he was an honest guy. But he stuck to his guns, buoyed up without fear of all this, blah, blah, blah. And then he says, strongest affection for native Australia land. And finally, he says to Lord Brisbane, blah, 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 well done, offering my, happens to colony my sincere gratitude of their good fortune, having an author such distinguished reputation as Sir Thomas Brisbane. Actually, Brisbane, whether he was told, he wanted to put back a lot of the things that Macquarie had done, but luckily they were so embroiled and they were so dug into the way the place worked that he didn't have much chance. So Macquarie came back home. This man Biggs wrote 3 reports. All 3 of them were really words put into his mouth. And Macquarie was not unreasonably, and Elizabeth, very upset. Macquarie had been told he would have a nice big pension if he did more than 6 years, and he did 12. And that was in great doubt when he got home. And it was most unfair that these 3 reports were published and he had really no say in what they said. So he went up to Jarvisfield, back up to his estate, but he died 4 years later in London, and he's buried in Mull at Grillin, and that the mausoleum. Anybody been to the mausoleum here? Oh, good. Well done. Anyway, it's administered by the Australian National Trust and the Scottish National Trust, and it's well worth a visit, particularly in the spring or when the bluebells are out. And that's the board outside. It's not very well signposted, actually. And that's on the board too, with this picture of Sydney. I must admit, I cannot quite believe that all this happened in Macquarie's time, but maybe it did. It must have done. And that's the picture I took on a visit, and you could see the lovely bluebells. And that's not my flag. I found that Australian flag lying on the ground. So I picked it up, and Janet took a picture. And I thought, if you can just bear with me for 1 minute or more, I'm just going to read you the words that are on that plaque. Could I have a little bit more light? Because I think they're pretty remarkable and actually sum up pretty well what I've said. Here, in the hope of a glorious resurrection, lie the remains of the late Major General Lachlan Macquarie of Jarvisfield, who was born 31st January 1761 and died at London on the 1st of July 1824. The private virtues and amiable disposition with which he was endowed rendered him at once the most beloved husband, father and master, and the most enduring friend. He entered the army at the age of 15, and throughout the period of 47 years spent in the public service was uniformly characterized by animated zeal for his profession, active benevolence and generosity which knew no bounds. He was appointed governor of New South Wales in 1809, and for 12 years fulfilled the duties of that station with eminent ability and success. His services in that capacity have justly attached a lasting honour to his name, and wisdom, liberality and benevolence. To all the measures of his administration, his respect for the ordinances of religion and the ready assistance which he gave to every charitable institution. The unwearied assiduity with which he sought to promote the welfare of all classes of the community, the rapid improvement of the colony under his auspices, and the high estimation in which both his character and government were held, rendered him truly deserving of the appellation of which he has been distinguished, the Father of Australia. And there he is. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. That was fascinating. That really was, wasn't it? And actually, what occurred to me through that is that you should say the characteristics of Australia were really sort of grounded in Macquarie's, didn't it? That lack of deference and that whole approach to meritocracy and competitiveness.
Well, I think so.
Well, he obviously inculcated them, and they are kind of national characteristics that we recognise now. So that was fascinating. I'm sure people will have observations or questions or. Yeah, Chris.
Just an observation. It strikes me while the rap was going on in Australia, John McDonnell, also a Scot, was playing a similar role in Canada.
Yeah.
And many things in Canada are named after him. And now he's fallen out of favour in disgracing fact for many of the things that he did while he was in power. Whereas here we have someone who was almost the reverse, who was virtually unknown, but now he's being given some sort of prominence and kind of credit for all the things that he did.
Only by me. I don't think I walked up from Circular Quay, the Cove, Sydney Harbour Cove, trying to find Macquarie Place, right, where they've got the anchor of the Sirius. That's the first ship that went in the first fleet, flagship, and with the supply. And there's this, this anchor, a real anchor, and it's the obelisk, and there's all sorts of other things, and there's statues. And I must have asked 10 Aussies where it was, and not one of them knew. So although the name, everybody's heard the name Macquarie, to be honest, I'm not sure that an awful lot of them know why or where he came from or who he was. I think life's too busy for that. I don't know. And also I think it's sad that they don't know more about him, because I think the young in Australia now, rather like it's happening here, I think, the young are the ones who are saying how terrible we all were, how ghastly colonialism was, and how we ruined the world by it. I don't know. I'm not saying we didn't do some unfortunate things, but I think Macquarie's legacy is, as one said, is quite remarkable. It is really how I think Australia is today.
But he's not taught in schools in Australia. You don't think he's part of the curriculum? It doesn't pop up in.
I don't know. I have to admit, when I went to school in Melbourne, age 7, the first bit of history I ever learned was Captain Cook. I can remember that.
Yeah.
I'm sure it's all changed.
I suspect, yes, because there's so much
and
more.
Also, I think there've been a lot of, since that book, The Fatal Shore, was written, there's been a lot of people, proper historians, going into it and finding out actually that, this wasn't the total story.
And I guess Australia is much more multiracial now hasn't it, in
Australia
the
was
last 20, 30 years. So
incredibly
it's going to have a very different perspective.
So, you know, this Australia Day is a bit of an anomaly,
Yeah.
I suppose. But, I mean, when you think that, you know, 100 years after Macquarie, the Australian Army was being slaughtered at Gallipoli.
Yeah.
You know, in 100 years. So they made fantastic bones. And that's because of this get up and go work ethic that they've got. I think.
Can I ask, you were mentioning earlier on that there weren't the clearances of the native people, you know, the indigenous people.
Yeah.
Was that purely in New South Wales? Because certainly in what's modern day Tasmania, Van Diemen's Land, there was a Turkish.
Tasmania was quite different.
Yeah, and then Western Australia, I think there were also a lot
Yeah.
of
But you see,
Aboriginals.
well, Macquarie, I did call Macquarie, he was a very nasty, well, was a governor of Hobart, Tasmania, that was miles away from Macquarie. And Macquarie had a big fight with him and tried to stop what he was doing. And Macquarie actually Greenway laid out quite a few of the, have you been to Hobart? It's a grid system of these roads. He laid out the, and then Port Arthur in Hobart in Tasmania was the big sort of nasty camp for convicts. It was maybe it was because the Macquarie influence wasn't in Tasmania so much. That
It was
possibly
quite notorious.
might well be the reason.
Yeah, Peter.
In preparation for this talk, Tim, I had a look at the latest edition of the Dictionary of National Biography.
Right.
And the entry there was by Professor John Reid, who wrote the definitive biography of Macquarie in the 1980s. And something must have changed with Macquarie, because at the beginning of the biography, it says, he gained his own promotion by ingratiating himself with his superiors and by dissimulation. He drank heavily and showed signs of dissipation. Extravagant and snobbish, his deference, his urge to please, his longing to be admired, and his prickliness all revealed his insecurity. And yet clearly, by the time he got to Australia, it was very different. I mean, what? Have you any
I think he was. I think he did like to be all things to all men. I think he did. I think that was true. And I've read quite a few books. I've never heard about his excessive drinking. Never. In fact, I haven't.
This was in the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, which came out a few years ago, and that's Professor Reid, who was the Australian. But I mean, he goes on to say he did great things in Australia. But I'm just intrigued at
Are they talking about his time in India?
Well, he's talking generally about his life before Australia. But he then, to be fair, he goes on and says about Australia, self-effacing humanity and a common touch. He chose to use his vast authority to attempt nothing less than the regeneration of the fallen men and women under his sway. So I think the Dictionary of National Biography chimed with what you said about his later career.
Well, I mean, I may have overegged it, but I'm not sure that I have. I mean, he wasn't perfect, and he did make enemies, and he made a lot of enemies from the people who, were going not doing so well through his rules.
And they were mainly people who were influential and had connections, weren't they?
So these exclusives were
Same everywhere.
a real right-wing cabal, you know.
The same thing happened to Franklin.
Yeah, absolutely.
The Arctic explorer, after his first expedition to Canada, he was sent to be governor of Tasmania.
Yes. Yeah.
And he was, in effect, sent home because the settlers found him much too liberal.
I remember. Yeah.
A little bit later than this.
Yeah. Well, who was the judge? I mean, Liverpool, Lord Liverpool was the Prime Minister. He was staunchly against Macquarie, and then Bathurst was a bit more okay. But these MacArthur and Marsden and these, I mean, I think there was an element that, the right-wing Tory with a capital T, locked in London, didn't, they felt insecure if these convicts were going to take over what they thought was their exclusive jobs.
It's interesting, David Taylor's latest book, one of the fascinating things there is the settlers who went out from Dunashton in the 1820s to Tasmania, then became some of the richest people in Australia. So that's the Badeneth contribution.
And I guess it was also part of the timing, wasn't it? I mean, partly Lachlan Macquarie has been through a lot of interesting experiences before Australia, which would have helped shape him. American War of Independence, East India Company, they would have all been influences. And I guess in Westminster, having just lost America, they didn't want to risk, losing one is unfortunate, losing two is and losing three could be even worse. So I guess there was
I think there was an element of insecurity in the government in London, thinking that, this wasn't the way this sort of socialist state might sort of implode on. I don't know.
Yeah.
Anyway, I mean, I think maybe it was Scotland, maybe it was his upbringing that, eventually came round in the circle. And I mean, how else would you have done that travel in 1790 to go to all those different countries?
Yes. That's right, there's no trail finders then.
Flippant comment, perhaps, but he had a very nice wife. You might well have influence.
I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
Maybe I didn't emphasize that enough because she was, it was a duo. The whole thing was a duo. And actually, there were a lot of people who were not just unhappy with Macquarie, they were particularly unhappy with Elizabeth because of exactly what you said. And she was a woman.
Alan.
The date right next year is the bicentennial of his death. Is there likely to be a
I don't know.
big party in
There's just a question there was about bicentenary. Next year is the bicentenary of Macquarie's death.
I mean, whether he says, there's one. I mean, even I think somehow we've got to recognise him a bit more in Scotland. Actually, it's like my other known is Cochrane. Cochrane is Nelson. To me, Nathan is a Nelson of Scotland, and the only place you see a statue of him is you go to Chile.
Well, you did find the baby, didn't you?
Right, well, that's another talk, I think. Yeah, Chris again.
Was the Captain Bligh that you mentioned the same Captain Bligh later of the Bounty?
Former of the Bounty.
Former of the Bounty.
Yeah, he was. Bligh is a bit of a malign man. He was sent by Sir Joseph Banks to be governor of Australia because he was a disciplinarian, and he was thought that he would be able to quell the rum corps and get some discipline into the colony, which was fast. I mean, it's the same old story: women and drink. That hasn't changed very much. And actually, there's a rather good statue of Bligh at Circular Quay, and the Australians have had the temerity to write on the back in a big one that actually that Bligh was rather better than anybody thought, and he did a lot of quite good things for Australia. But it was unfortunate that whether he was found under his bed like that picture showed, I don't know. But that's what we.
Can I just ask, how did he parcel out the land?
Yes, he did. Sorry, I should have mentioned that. He did exactly that. If you said you were a convict, I mean, this is a bit simplistic, and you could grow lettuces, he said, okay, off you go, and there's a hectare of land, go and grow your lettuces. And it's exactly what he did. Exactly. And that thereby he got the trade going, and he got New South Wales, self-sufficient. And absolutely.
And ownership of property and land.
And ownership, yeah.
Right.
I mean, he gave plots of land. The other thing he did actually was that he was so, I mean, this slave trade thing, I'm not going to condone it, but Wilberforce was the guy that stopped it, right?
Yeah.
And Macquarie named one of his districts Wilberforce because he was so enamored with what Wilberforce was trying to do.
There was another hand I saw. Yes, at the back.
It's like historical. And your picture of Brigg, the guy who came to investigate quarry.
Oh, yes, the big, yes.
Describes him as a QC. That was long before Queen Victoria came to the crown.
Well, I don't know why it was for QC anyway. You were maybe a great lawyer, but yeah, he was. He wasn't a very. I mean, Macquarie. I mean, you could say, it's a terrible expression, sucked up. But we met him off the ship, took him back to Government House, lauded him, but Big just wrote all this stuff. And I think he'd been told to do it.
One observation on the south-east corner of Mull, there lies a rock that's charted as Macquarie's Rock. And if you're heading down the east shore of Mull, cutting around to the Ross, you could come to some grief on this isolated Macquarie's Rock.
Always sensible, so
Well, there's a couple of. I never know. What's it called? Salem or Salem? I never know. Salem. There's a couple of his cottages, Macquarie cottages, still there on the corner, almost exactly like they were in his day. And nobody seems to make anything of them.
Peter,
how much do we know about his early years? I mean, a dictionary of national biography more or less says that his father was a joiner, but he was connected to a landowning family, which presumably would help him get a commission. But do we know anything about his parents?
I mean, he does come up. The books say his father was a carpenter. But the Macquaries were quite a well-known clan, but a very poor clan, I think.
But to get a commission.
Yeah, well, to be honest, there's not much. I couldn't find it, but I do think it's extraordinary that from the age of 15, he did so well. And he always called Elizabeth Mrs. M, and she always called him Macquarie, just like that. And it's a shame really that he wasn't recognised when he got home with any sort of award or honour, or he became a Major General whilst he was in Australia. He went out as a colonel. But I think Napoleon was pretty important at that time. We were trying to fight the French, and I can't think that there was too much worry about what a few daddies were doing in Sydney. I don't know.
yeah.
Why is his mausoleum in Greenland and not on Alva?
I think because although he was born in Alva, he didn't spend too long in Alva, but Jarvis Field was the estate that he bought with his first wife's money, and that was where.
I think Jarvis Field was down at Craignewer.
Is it?
I think so.
Oh well, whenever he bought that land because the house that they lived in, that house, you go past the mausoleum and then you turn left down to the loch. So they came back and lived very close to there.
That's Greenland House.
All right.
I actually got a ledger. I was given a ledger by somebody on Mull who didn't want to be named. And this ledger, they set up a company that was trading in the West Indies but they never mentioned what the product was. But the more you read it and the more you looked into it, the more the product was obviously slaves.
Slaves, yeah.
Well, I'm not sure where that is.
And I gave this, I had to return this book that was stolen from the library in Brooklyn without a telling the people where it came from. It's actually an employee that stole it.
Yeah, yeah.
And when I gave it back to Brooklyn House, the owner of Brooklyn House said, you've maybe shed a lot of light on where the old money came from.
Right.
Because it was a very profitable ledger, basically, but never mentioned the product.
Well, I mean, it may be that nobody, you know, that there wasn't, Elizabeth couldn't find, the mausoleum wasn't, he was buried there, and then the mausoleum came slightly afterwards, if I remember rightly. But it may be that was just a convenient place close to where he'd born and, you know, his associations with Mull. I don't
It's
know.
interesting, that's a bit of Australian territory.
Yeah, well, we came, a few years ago, we came back from Australia in a one of those big jets in the back, and there were all these kids with us from Scots College. There's a Scots College, a rather smart school in Sydney called Scots College, and they all wear kilts, and they all play bagpipes. And there's one in Melbourne called Scots College. And I said to this young boy sitting next to me, I said, "What are you doing?" He said, "Oh, I'm member of the Scots College band, pipe band. We're coming to play in Mull." And they were all coming over to play at the mausoleum. And I think, well, I know the ambassador, the Australian ambassador from London was coming up. So it was quite a big do. They were coming all the way in this smart aeroplane to play bagpipes in Mull from Sydney.
Well, I hope it didn't rain. Any more questions? Okay, I think we've given Tim a really good grilling tonight, but it's good. I mean, it just shows the interest that there's been in the topic, and it's been fascinating. And we're all going to go away a bit better informed. So, thank you very much indeed for the presentation. And a tiny gesture of appreciation. I'm not sure if it's Australian or not.
Oh, no, no.
It should be, shouldn't it? No, it's probably.
Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you all very much for coming along. We're back again in a fortnight with another one of our regular speakers. Peter is coming and is going to talk to us about the stuff we don't know about Shackleton and the discovery of the Endurance. So it's Shackleton's Forgotten Heroes in 2 weeks' time. So hopefully you'll be back. It'll be another really interesting and informative evening ahead. So thank you all for coming this evening. Thank you again, Tim. Good night.